Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to week 37 of our long walk through the book of 1 Corinthians. It's good to see all of you here this morning. So, do you ever try to hide parts of your house when people come over to visit? You know this experience? Like, oh my goodness, we got people coming over today. We got to try to straighten up and listen, whatever we do, let's not let them down into the downstairs bathroom, okay? We're just going to use the upstairs bathroom, right? I mean, kids are usually aware of this tension or this dynamic, I guess would be the better word, often to the point where, you're just like, come on, kids, we got to straighten up. And your kids might say, well, who's coming over, right? But, you want to try to put your best foot forward, and so you can stuff things in closets or strategically lock doors or this sort of thing. Well, have you ever felt that way about the Bible? Like, there's parts of the Bible you really don't want to introduce people to. You're like, man, I got this friend, they don't know the Lord, they're not following. I'd love for them to hear the gospel and believe in Jesus and see the scripture as God's word and come join our church. But sometimes it's dangerous to give someone a Bible. Because, man, there are some parts of the Bible where standing and reading them from where we're standing and reading them from today, they make you cringe pretty hard. You're like, oh my goodness, I hope this new person to Christianity does not read this part of the Bible. Well, everybody, we have just such a part of the Bible for us to look at today. In fact, I had so much fun with this week, I'm like, let's talk about it for 2 weeks. So listen, today we are going to venture down into one of the downstairs bathrooms of the Bible, if you will. In fact, it seems so jarring what Paul says here, and really in ways so different from how he speaks elsewhere, that numerous scholars have proposed this is in fact not original to Paul, but this is an addition of a later scribe. Well, that would be neat and tidy. We could just cut it out and throw it away. No such luck, however, because there's no manuscript evidence for that. So this bathroom seems to be firmly part of the house here. So we got to wrestle with it, all right? But really, the aspects that seem offensive or difficult about the Bible really do vary by culture and time. Other parts of the world wouldn't blink an eyeball at this passage, or other ones like it. But we're standing here in 2020, those aspects of the Bible which raise the most questions for us, tensions for us, have to do with the Bible's treatment of women, atrocities, war, and genocide in the Old Testament, how the Bible treats homosexuality, slavery, right? These raise difficult questions for us. And we got to face it head on, because look, people are coming over today, and they're going to need to use the bathroom, right? Like, we want people to read the Bible. We believe this is the Word of God, and so it's worth our while to spend some time here today. And just maybe a bathroom's not quite as bad as we thought. So today we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16, or at least that was my plan. But like I say, I actually only made it 1/3 of the way through the passage. So today we'll really just look at the first third of this passage because there's plenty to talk about. Okay, but just to kind of clarify up front, sometimes it's better to say where you're going and then say it. Look here on your outline. I've tried to clarify the issue here. First of all, look, what's the issue Paul's facing in this passage? Here it is. Some Christian Corinthian women were not wearing head coverings when leading in public worship. That was the particular instance, the particular situation that Paul is dealing with. And if we can extract from that cultural setting what is perhaps the timeless principle that we could learn from, it would be this. We must all practice modesty and God-honoring appropriateness, especially in worship. That's kind of where we're going. It's kind of where we'll end up. Whatever's going on, Paul has heard about this additional thing that's going on in the Corinthian church, and he's so troubled by this that he takes time to write about it at some length here in chapter 11. And he'll have 4 arguments in this section to try to convince the women in the Corinthian church to handle this matter differently. Like I say, today we're just going to look at part 1, which will actually be the first of these 4 arguments. Okay, but let's, at the front end, remind ourselves that when we go up to pick up the Bible, this is not like picking up and reading a newspaper, right? We are, in essence, in some ways, stepping into a time machine and going back into a different era and a different culture. And some things, when we read the Bible, transfer very easily, 1-to-1, between the ancient audience and us. So Jesus said, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, that doesn't need much cultural translation. But on some other issues, it's a little harder to wrestle with precisely what we see. So notice here on the screen what one scholar writes about this. in the context of the passage we hear today. It says this, not all of Paul's arguments make sense to us today on a first reading, but that is because Paul is trying to persuade the Corinthian women to wear head coverings, not women today. Had he been writing a letter to us, he would have dealt with entirely different issues and reasoned in a different way. It's easy for modern Western readers to assume that cultures elsewhere think as we do. We are impatient with other cultures' logic. Paul, a pastor and a missionary, is concerned about getting his point across to his people, not with impressing modern Western readers with arguments that would work transculturally. Paul employs a transcultural argument only when he's making a transcultural point. And the wearing of head coverings, as we have suggested above, is not one of those points. All right? So let's dive into this and see what we're talking about here. So look, on your outline, here's part one. And like I say, this is really only as far as we will get today. But I've simply called it this, Paul's argument from family. Remember, he's setting out to try to correct a practice he's heard about that is causing some scandal in the Corinthian church. And his first argument he's going to field comes from family. So look here at verse 2. Matt actually covered this last week. We'll back up to it a bit. Paul says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. Now, that surprises me a little bit because that's awful positive, you know? By all the things we've heard about this dysfunctional church there in Corinth, I'm kind of surprised that Paul says, I praise you for holding to the traditions I taught you. Like, that's not exactly the impression I would get, Paul, based on where we've been. But look, Paul's only dealing with them on the issues that are causing trouble. And there's a whole lot of other issues that Paul's completely silent on about them. There's a whole bunch of other ways where they are faithfully living a Christian life and holding faithfully to the traditions that Paul had passed on to them. So he kind of starts off on the positive here. You know, if you got to critique someone or bring some criticism, it's always kind of good to try to be gentle and find something good to praise at the front end. Paul is doing that here. All right, so look at verse 3. Here he launches into it. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. So this seems completely out of nowhere. Where are you going with this, Paul? We got to keep reading to see what he's dealing with here. Look at verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. Okay. Well, here's the problem Paul's dealing with. It's the conduct of some of the Corinthian Christians when they are praying or prophesying in the church. So here's two aspects of Christian worship. All right, praying is the Godward aspect, right? Talking to God like we've done here today in our corporate prayer. Prophecy is the human-focused aspect of ministry, right? And prophecy is, in its essence, delivering a message from God. It's debated what Paul means by prophecy. It's either a direct message from God that someone conveys, or it's something like I'm doing here today, which is kind of like pastoral teaching or preaching or something like this, okay? We'll come back to that in a minute. The issue is, what are they wearing on their heads? Paul is dealing with this issue that is causing some trouble and scandal there in Corinth. Paul says the men should not be wearing things on their heads. He says the women should be wearing things on their heads. Okay, so that's a presenting issue. We'll get back to that in a minute. Let's go back now and look at verse 3 in light of that. He says, I want you to realize the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Notice Paul is not setting out here to write a theology of gender. Rather, what he's doing is dealing with a particular problem that is causing issues here in Corinth. And this issue involves what? Their heads. Their literal heads, like they're wearing and not wearing things on their heads. So to set this argument up, Paul's using a play on words. He's trying to be punny, so to speak. And so he sets up the way he's going to deal with how they're handling their physical heads by developing this argument and saying everybody has a metaphorical head, okay? Before we get into that, you should know, look at verse 3, in Greek there is no separate word for woman or wife or man and husband, okay? So even though it says man and woman, probably because of what he says later, we should understand that he's talking about husbands and wives. So this is an argument from family dynamics in relationships in the first century, okay? Okay, so we know what Paul is talking about when he's talking about their literal heads and whether they should wear things or not. But what does he mean here in verse 3? I want you to realize the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. This is the metaphorical head that he's developing, that he's going to use to talk about how they're handling their literal heads. Now the problem is, it's not entirely clear what Paul is trying to emphasize. And the real interesting one, actually all of them flow together, but the interesting one for us is the head of the woman is man. What does that mean? What is Paul trying to emphasize? And it's not entirely clear. It's heavily debated. So there's three essential options by what Paul means here by head in each one of these metaphorical usages. Okay, first is it could have the sense of authority over. Now, this makes sense in English because we use this term head in English all the time for this, right? You're the head of the board, you're the head of the company, you go sit at the head table. So this has to do with authority, right? And that could be. The problem is this word is not often used in Greek to convey the idea of authority over. So it could be what he's saying, but again, that's not the most common use of this. And there's no other indicators in this passage that Paul is talking about authority or subordination. But it could be, some people argue that way. Second possibility, other people will argue that head here has the sense of source. Is the source of something. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in English, but actually this Greek word for head does get used this way to convey the idea of source sometimes. And one of the things that contributes to this, as bizarre as it is, all right, as bizarre as this is to think about, you got to remember, this is ancient thinking. Ancient medical thinking, did they know everything we know about the body? No, they sure didn't. One of the prevailing medical understandings was that semen is created by the brain in the head. This is where semen comes from. Side note, they thought men and women both create semen in their brain. We'll talk about that more next week. So notice how this helps to understand the word head, how this could stand for source. Because in generation, the semen comes from the head, comes from the brain. And in ancient thinking, the head also is the source of life for the whole body. Life flows out of the head to the rest of the body. And so notice Paul uses the word head in this way. Look here at the screen at Colossians 2:19. He's talking about people who have rejected Christ. It says, they have lost connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows as God causes it to grow. So notice what association does Paul connect with Jesus as the head of the body of the church? Well, very good ancient understanding. The head is the source of life. So notice from here the body is growing from the head. So it could be that when Paul says all of these head relationships, he could be emphasizing source. And please notice we do have explicit confirmation of this in our passage, because look here at verse 8 on your outline. Paul is going to go on to talk about creation, the creation story in the Bible. And do you remember in the creation story of the Bible, where is the first woman said to be taken from? All right, look at verse 8. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. So Paul does connect the idea later in this passage, going back to the creation story of the first woman being taken from the man as her source. So it could be. Problem is that's not terribly common use of this word in Greek either. Okay, third possibility is this, and probably most likely, that it means preeminent, foremost, most visible, in the sense of like a representative. So if you think about it, the head is and most of the time this word is used in Greek over all the literature. It's used just for a person's head in relation to their body, like of course. And so notice this is the most visible part of a person. It stands out the most. It is the most recognizable. It's the part you talk to, yes? And in Greek, just like in English, it was used in a representative sense as well. Like we'll say 200 head of cattle. What do we mean by that? Do we mean a pile of 200 cow heads in a pyramid with flies buzzing around them, those 200 heads of cattle? You know, is that what we mean? What do we mean? Well, in English usage, we just mean 200 cows or oxen or whatever the term might be, okay? And so this is very plausible as well. And this is, compared to the other two, this seems to be the most common usage of this term in Greek metaphorically. And notice we have confirmation for this in our passage as well, because Paul is going to go over and talk about that the way the various people in the church are behaving, this is bringing shame or honor to their metaphorical head. And when we're talking about shame and honor, this is public now. This is talking about in the perspective of the public. And so it's very plausible what Paul is talking about here is the way a person's behavior reflects on their representative, so to speak. So it's hard to know, okay, which one of these three is the primary sense of it. If we had to pick one, interestingly, the least likely is the first one I would suggest to you. And this is the one we most instinctively think. Oh, Paul's talking about headship. This must be talking about authority over and subordination. But actually, this is the least likely of the three senses here. It's very rare for this word to be used that way in Greek, and there's no more confirmation of that in the passage. Far more likely, Paul's talking about source or this representative role. But, to be fair, sometimes I like to hedge my bets and say, why can't it have elements of all three, right? This is a word with multiple meanings. And so in the first century legal setting, was the husband an authority over the wife, legally? Absolutely. Was the understanding that man was in some sense a source for woman, if we look at the creation story? Yes. And in an ancient setting, does the man represent the woman in society? Absolutely. We can see how all three of these are also true of Christ with relation to us and even Christ to God. So, I don't know. But interestingly, again, if we're picking one, the one that we most often default to is actually probably the least likely. Let's keep going. Look at verse 3 again. I want you to realize the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head dishonors his head. Here's Paul's play on words. Okay? Look at the end of verse 4. What's he mean by head? Does he mean his literal head or does he mean his metaphorical head? He means his metaphorical head. Paul is using puns here, plays on words, right? So he says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered, his physical head covered, dishonors his metaphorical head, Christ. Why? Why in the world would a Christian man in Corinth who would pray with something covering his head, why would that bring dishonor to Christ? That doesn't make any sense. Well, to us it might not. But guess what? In the ancient world, guess who covered their heads, if you're a man, when you worship and pray? Romans, okay? Look at this picture. Here's a picture of a statue of the emperor, the great emperor Caesar Augustus. And in this statue, he is portrayed as the Pontificus Maximus, the high priest of all of Rome. And so notice most of the time he's portrayed with his head bare, but here, what does he have up over his head? This is his toga flipped up over his head. This is a sign of his piety, his devotion to the gods. Because if you are a Roman man, when you go to pray, to worship, or to sacrifice to the gods, what are you supposed to do? You flip that thing up. This demonstrates your faithfulness and your piety to the Roman gods. So what Paul seems to be saying to the Corinthian Christians is, when you guys are praying, I do not want you to be emulating the practice of pagan worship. You guys are Romans there in Corinth. You used to worship the gods like this. Not now. Now when you come, you leave that behind. You don't mix elements of pagan worship with your worship to the Lord. And if those, apparently in Paul's perspective, from his point of view, if the Corinthian men are praying and prophesying in the assembled church and they cover their head, this brings shame to Christ because they're mixing practices that they should have left behind from paganism. So that's why in your outline, look at your outline, I called this what I call bonnets, bikinis, and the worship of false gods. We'll get to the bonnets and bikinis later. But here's the reference to the worship of false gods. Paul says, don't do this. If you bring this into your assembly, Christian men, if you worship like this, it's going to dishonor your head, Christ. Yes. Okay? Look at verse 5. And actually, we see that the real problem had to do with the women in Corinth, though, because Paul spends more time focusing on them, but he keeps the men in there to counterbalance it. Verse 5, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. It gets confusing because, again, Paul is going back and forth between literal and metaphorical here, right? So every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered uncovered dishonors her head. Metaphorically, Paul said the man, the husband, or the father in the first century. It's the same as having her literal head shaved. So interestingly, look, the situation is reversed for the women. Paul says the men are supposed to pray or prophesy with head uncovered, and the opposite is to be true for the women. So before we jump into that, I want you to notice something, which we don't even notice, probably, but it's very significant in an ancient context. What does Paul assume that the Christian women are doing in the Corinthian church? What are they participating in? Notice they're prophesying and praying. Now, most people recognize what's in view here is not private prayer, private prophecy, but public prayer and public prophecy in the assembled worship service. Just like we hit chapters 12 and 14, Paul's going to return to this subject of prophecy, and it's done in the context of delivering God's message to the people. Now, if women were praying and prophesying in their homes privately with head uncovered, Paul wouldn't care. In that culture, women were free to not wear head coverings in their home. The reason this has become a problem is it's in the public worship. Okay, but don't miss the significance of this. This is notable. Here we see a significant participation for women in the early church. That's significant. And how high up there on the totem pole is the activity of prophecy? Like I said, it's either a direct message from God given supernaturally in the moment that speaks with God's authority, or it's something like I'm doing here, which we would call preaching. So either way, this is very significant. Paul understands and assumes that women are involved in the public leading in the worship service, whether in prayer, prophecy, or depending on how we define it, preaching like this. And remember, Paul will give a sort of pecking order in other places, and he shows that prophecy is to be regarded higher than teaching. So this is a high role for women in the early church, and this would stand out over against a more limited participation in other religious contexts at times, although women freely participated in prophecy in the Greco-Roman world as well. Okay, so Paul has no problem with this. He probably taught them to involve women like this. Okay, so these are probably some of the traditions that he compliments them for holding on to. And notice how significant it is, because the New Testament does indicate, back then at least, that the top leadership of the church was male. And that shouldn't surprise us in the first century, right? But even given that context, in that first century setting, we still have a significant and at some level authoritative participation of women in the worship service. So let's not miss that. That's actually significant, even as some of the rest of this raises some question marks for us where we're standing from right now. Okay, but because this is public worship, the way the women are involving themselves and conducting themselves here has caused scandal in the First Corinthian church. First Corinthian? First Corinthian. Just Corinthian church. Look at verse 5. Again, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. So who is her head? So again, in a first century setting, the wife is under the legal authority of her husband, or if she's unmarried, her father. This is a legal reality in the first century. Corinth is a Roman colony. Listen to what one scholar writes about the legal situation in the Roman world. Look at the screen. The punishment of the head of the household for the misdemeanors of his family in the early Christian shepherd of Hermas is representative of the prevailing legal structure. According to Roman patria potestas, this is the Roman family social structure, the oldest living male, whether father, grandfather, or great-grandfather, controlled all the other members of the family regardless of age or political importance. Only the paterfamilias, the male head of the family, was recognized as a full person in the eyes of Roman law and society. As such, he held the power of life and death over other family and assumed accountability for their behavior. So, if I'm your dad, my dad is gone, so I'm the head of the family. You are my adult son. If you do something that steps way out of line with what I approve of, if you bring shame on the family, if you are an adult man, an adult Roman citizen, I as your father can have you put to death just because I command it. Why? Because I'm the head. I'm the legal authority over my entire family. Marriages within the empire were ordinarily arranged so that the wife remained legally and religiously part of her father's family. Her relatives might with impunity remove her from the marriage and contract another more favorable alliance even against her will. This system wrought marital instability that Paul countered with the call for men and women to be bound together as one flesh, head and body, and both as members of Christ's body. If a Roman woman was formally attached to her husband's family rather than her own, her legal position became that of a daughter with respect to her own husband. In the transfer to this family, she was said to have forfeited head in Latin. In an era when a woman was legally required to have a head, Paul called upon the woman to join herself in an attitude of both accountability and commitment to a husband, free of repressive family hierarchy and responsive to Christ as head. So this language that Paul uses to set up this situation is ripe within a Roman legal context. If you are a woman in the first century, this is your situation. You have a head, whether we define it as authority, source, or preeminent thing. Preeminent? Verse 5, again, if every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, meaning her metaphorical head, either her husband or her father, who is her authority and representative in that legal setup. Okay, so let's raise the question, why doesn't Paul say to the woman, if you behave this way, you bring dishonor to your head, the metaphorical head, Christ, just like the man has. Like notice he says the metaphorical head of the man is Christ, but the metaphorical head of the woman is the man. Isn't it true that the conduct of a Christian woman would reflect equally upon Christ? Yeah, absolutely. But this issue of head covering was all wrapped up with dynamics of gender and particularly marriage. And so because of this, I think Paul skews it differently to point at the destructive way this would reflect upon the husband or the father in that social setting. Okay, now we still haven't even talked about why head coverings and what is this even about. So what did a head covering signify for a woman in the first century? And we should probably envision some sort of shawl that would keep her face bare, come over her hair. So kind of like almost what we saw in the emperor. What did this convey in the first century? Well, look how one scholar summarizes it. Essentially, this had to do with modesty and respectable attire. In the first century, women were expected to keep their hair out of sight, married women at least, when in public, because this was connected to modesty and communicating sexual restraint. So here's a summary. Within the symbolic clothing code of first century Roman society, a veil or a hood constituted a warning. It signified that the wearer was a respectable woman and no man dare approach her, for example, as one potentially or actually sexually available. So the woman's use and wearing of this head covering was a way to demonstrate her respectability, her honor, and her virtue. In ancient thinking, a woman's hair was just about the most beautiful and most desirable part of her body. You know, cultures look at bodies differently. Cultures highlight and value different parts of the body. In the ancient world, there was a lot of attention given to the woman's hair. So look at this. This is interesting. This is from a play. So this is a second century play. So this is a work of fiction. So the character in the play says this, but you know, even though this is fiction, this is conveying ancient thinking at one level or not. So this is, Apuleius wrote it. It's a play called Metamorphosis, or I prefer the other title, The Golden Ass. Donkey, in the sense of donkey. Look what the character Lucian says, who's sort of a scoundrel. Okay? He says, "It has always been the prime concern of my life to observe in public the heads and tresses of beautiful women, and then to conjure up the image at home for leisurely enjoyment." You know? That's interesting. He's like, oh, I stare at their hair, and then I go home and I think about it because that's so desirable and so attractive. In Jewish culture, a wearing of a veil was also part of sexual modesty. Interestingly enough, if you are a married Jewish woman and you go out in public without wearing a head covering, that is grounds for divorce. Your husband can divorce you for that. Because what are you communicating if you're a married woman and you go out in public with no head covering? You're essentially saying, hey, I'm available. Who's interested? Come on. This is what this communicates in the first century. Yes, okay. Look at this. Here's another summary from somebody else. Greek women were usually covered in social life, as sculpture confirms, except in their or their relations' homes. And that gives us a clue to maybe what's going on. We'll get back to that in a minute. Look at this passage out of the ancient writer Philo. Philo is a Jewish man. He lives in Alexandria, Egypt. He is alive right now when Paul is writing this letter. So here's a contemporary of Paul. And here in this passage, he is writing about what is done as part of the test for a woman, testing her if she is guilty of adultery. Look what he says here. He says, she has her head covering removed as part of this process, that she may be judged with her head bared and stripped of the symbol of modesty regularly worn by women who are wholly innocent. So what does Philo understand the significance of the married woman to be when wearing a head covering? It is a symbol of modesty regularly worn by women who are wholly innocent. It's a way of showing virtue. So again, verse 5, how many times are we going to read this in one day? I don't know. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It's the same as having her head shaved. So if the ancient world values a woman's long hair so much, you can understand why this would be considered shameful to have it cut off or shaved off. This makes her look more like a man in ancient thinking. This is considered insulting. This is a shameful thing, a terrible loss. It's also part of the punishment inflicted on a woman who's found guilty of adultery. All right, look what the ancient Roman writer Tacitus says. He says this, very rare for so numerous a population is adultery, the punishment for which is prompt and in the husband's power, because in a Roman setting, of course, everything's in the husband's power. Having cut off the hair of the adulteress and stripped her naked, he expels her from the house in the presence of her kinsfolk and then flogs her through the whole village. But notice part of that is the cutting of the hair or the shaving of the head, which is calculated to be an insult, something embarrassing, something shameful. Okay, so Paul indulges in some hyperbole here. He says, look, Corinthian Christian women, you are up front, so to speak, leading in worship. And you are prophesying and you are praying while laying aside your head covering. Like, this is incredibly immodest. This is incredibly provocative. You can't be doing this in hyperbole. If you're going to do that, just shave your head, right? If you're going to act so shamefully, man, just shave your head. So why was this happening? Did these Christian women do this on purpose? Did they realize what they were doing? Was this unintentional? At this distance, it's really hard to know. We don't know precisely what was going on. But one thing that might have contributed to the confusion was this. Where are the early Christians meeting to worship? In homes. Is that private space or public space? Private. Where were married Greco-Roman women expected to not wear a head covering? In their homes. So what might have led to this in part was a confusion over what kind of space this is. These women say, look, this is my home. I host this church. We are all one family now. We call each other brother and sister, so surely this doesn't matter anymore. There's one possibility. Another possibility is this could have socioeconomic significance as well. And actually, we've seen this dynamic over and over through the whole book of 1 Corinthians. We'll see it again in the next section talking about the Lord's Supper. There's a clash in values between the more elite and the rich Christians and the lower class ones. And there's some evidence to suggest that it's the more elite, the more rich and wealthy women that would have tended to be more progressive on this head covering issue, which said, I don't need to wear that. By the way, look at these beautiful braids. Check out the jewels I could put in it. Where the more poor, low-class women would be more prone to continue the more traditional wearing of head covering. So this could also be part of what is setting up this conflict. We don't really know, but what Paul says, you need to treat the worship as a public space with decorum, propriety. You can't be scandalous. You can't be going about immodestly. Men, you can't be repeating practices from pagan worship. Or if the issue is socioeconomic, look, we have to go bend over backwards and give up our rights not to cause offense. Right? So either way, we can see this is in line with so many of the arguments that Paul's been making through the book of 1 Corinthians. Okay, so notice Paul says, verse 6, after the semicolon, if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her head cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. In our culture where we're standing now, is it a disgrace for a woman to cut her hair or shave it? Does that bear any real social stigma? Is that a sign of sexual modesty or flirtation or anything? No, right? It does not bear that significance largely now. Whether or not hair is uncovered has nothing to do with sexual availability. So we can see why most churches in the United States nobody does this. But what if you are in a little Middle Eastern village today, still very conservative in ancient honor, shame culture? If you are a missionary in the Middle East leading a small church, are the women in there going to wear head coverings? Very probably. Because again, in that context now, this is a symbol of sexual faithfulness, respectability, propriety, this sort of thing. Okay, so that's why I put bikinis in the title, right? Like, there are places where swimsuits are very appropriate if you go to the beach. Okay, but what would be the problem if either men or women are up here leading worship, praying, preaching, or prophesying, whatever we like, and we're wearing swimsuits up here? At some level, unless we're on a beach in California, not even California probably, a beach in Hawaii, maybe we could get away with this at a church on the beach. But in most cases, that's going to be inappropriate, right? And distracting, especially if that swimsuit is kind of considered, well, it's a little provocative, So we can see that it would probably be about that level. For a woman to go up front in the first century Corinth and participate in worship without a head covering would probably be pretty close to wearing a swimsuit or a bikini or something. And Paul's like, you guys can't be doing this. The focus is supposed to be on God in the worship and not on yourselves, right? Okay, well, like I say, I meant to go through this whole passage. We made it through part 1 of 3, and it was like Thursday, and I'm like, I'm already too long. I can't handle the rest of this. So we will revisit this next week, and we'll continue through the second 2 parts of this. But what can we say so far? Well, let's put it this way, bottom line. And like I say, kind of as I said from the beginning, if we can extract what is culturally bound from this situation and go to the highest level of abstraction, say, okay, how could we apply these dynamics in a parallel way? Maybe we could say something like this. Seek to honor God and others in dress and conduct, as in every other aspect of life. Right? I mean, if we go to the highest level of abstraction here, seek to honor God and others in dress and conduct, as in every other area of life. Now, I think this passage will have other things to say about gender and marriage and husbands and wives, but we'll leave that to next week. And for now, just notice, this is Paul's point, right? Seek to honor God in the worship service, in dress and conduct and everything. So, 3 suggestions, or 3 ways to do this. First, by remembering our conduct reflects on Christ and other Christians, right? Remember, Paul sets up this sort of play on words where his point is, Christian, your conduct reflects either honor or dishonor onto Christ and other Christians. The way he sets it up, the man reflects honor or shame on his representative Christ. And in that context, he chose to structure the argument that first century Roman woman, your conduct reflects either shame or honor on your husband. And so notice, is it true that the way we conduct ourselves reflects, whether for good or ill, on God and other Christians, however we're connected to them? Yeah, absolutely. Right? I mean, the number one reason people give for rejecting faith in God is probably the problem of evil and suffering, but probably number 2 is, look at the hypocrisy among Christians. All right, so this is Paul the missionary saying, Corinthians, you can't be doing this, right? Because this reflects on Christ and one another. Second, by remembering, here we go. Second, by not mixing elements of other religions into our Christian faith. Okay, that's keying on what Paul said to the men here. He's like, do not wear that head covering. That is also a rich symbol in the first century Roman world. That is a picture of piety and devotion to the Greek gods. Now, what strikes me as interesting, Paul goes 2 different directions here. Right? To the woman, he says, maintain cultural expectations. Wear the head covering. To the man, he says, go against it. Why? I don't know. My guess is maybe Paul is happy for us to go along with respectability, propriety, modesty. But when that moves into the realm of idolatry and the worship of other gods, probably he gets a lot harder line. And so we might have expected him to say to the men, hey, cover your heads. That's what pious people do. But apparently this was so keyed to worship of the pagan gods, at least if we're understanding the dynamic right, he says, nope, you discard, you leave behind that aspect. And so, let's watch out with our devotion to the Lord. Let us practice Christian practices. Let us seek the Lord. Let us be undivided in our devotion to Him. And finally, last, by honoring one another sexually in dress, look, and thought. And man, I think that is really the heart of what Paul is saying here. The women were conducting themselves in a way that was sexually provocative and scandalous in the context of the worship service, and not even just participating, but when leading to some degree. And Paul says this cannot be. Now, as true it is that Christian women have an obligation to dress modestly and to give consideration, not to cause a stumbling block to men. Because I'm a man, I don't really feel like talking about that today to you women. I'll let you women talk among yourselves about that. But I would like to talk to the guys. Let's talk to us a little bit. Because one thing I don't like is oftentimes in our churches, the way the sexual modesty talk goes is like, now Christian women, you be careful. Make sure you're not showing too much skin and not wearing things that are too tight so those poor, helpless Christian men will have no choice but to stare at you and lust after you. I go, yeah, that's not really how it's said, right? But I think that men bear an equal responsibility here to guard our eyes, to guard our hearts, to convey a respect for our sisters and, of course, women in the broader culture. So a number of years ago, back in Bible college, we went to Moody Bible Institute, and I don't remember when I had this conversation. I think I had this conversation with Kaylani. I think it was her. She said there was this guy I knew, a fellow student at Bible college, and it was either her or someone else said, yeah, this guy has a real reputation among the women students for staring at their chests, like just in conversation. And I was so sobered by that, I was like, ooh, wow, really? Probably my first thought was, wait, what? Women can see where we're looking? Oh, no. I didn't think of that. No. Oof, painful. That a Christian guy in ministry school had this reputation. That's worrisome, right? Another experience I had. This one's painful still. So this is back, we're now in seminary, okay? So we're down in Texas. And we lived in this married student apartment complex building. And one day, we're going into the building. I'm by myself, okay? And there's this woman coming who also lives in the building. And so, being nice, I hold the door for her, okay? As I'm standing there holding the door, for whatever reason, my mind's full of other things, and I'm just kind of staring down at the floor mat. For some reason, I'm looking at the floor mat, and I'm like, that's an interesting floor mat. And I'm holding the door, and she goes by, and I go in to follow her, and there's this other guy who I knew a little bit following her, and he is glaring at me, and I'm like, oh, what the heck? Then I'm like, oh no, he thinks that as I'm standing there, I'm inspecting her rear end as she walks right by in front of me. And I'm like, oh no. Right? And I kept seeing this guy around school, and he would keep giving me these looks, just these stares like, I know what you really are, right? Like, this is a married student building, like, this is not my wife. Make things worse, I was part of a group presentation on sexual addiction with this guy, and like, over and over, he would like stare at me and, like, how do you bring something like that up to try to clarify? Like, 2 years later, hey buddy, do you remember that time I was holding the door and you thought I was staring at that woman? Well, see, there was this floor mat, and now knowing my luck, he's probably mad at me for some other reason, or I imagined it. He's like, what in the world are you talking about? And I'd be like, well, this floor mat, it was just there, and it was so interesting, and trick of perspective, and I don't know what I'm trying to say up here anymore. In the ancient world, men kept women locked up pretty good. And unfortunately, the perspective was, it was the woman's responsibility not to be seductive and to draw men into sexual sin. And an unfair amount of the weight was put on women in the ancient world. And I'll tell you what, legacies of this continues. I mean, I don't know if you've heard about stories of sexual assault that go on, and sometimes one of the first questions is, well, what was she wearing? Which is just awful, right? Jesus did not share this perspective. Look here at Matthew 5:27. He said, you've heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Notice he doesn't say it's her fault for not covering up or behaving properly. Now, as true as it is, Christian women, you bear a responsibility to think this through as well. But you guys, we have a responsibility here as well to honor women, first of all, in our hearts and our thoughts. That's the only place that it ever flows out of, and then act accordingly beyond that. So there's a mutual responsibility here, as we would expect. So seek to honor God and others in dress and conduct, as in every area of life. Well, I had good intentions to go all the way through this passage last week, but there's too much fun to be had. And why would we go too fast through an interesting passage like this? So we only got through part 1, Paul's argument from family. As Paul gets creative and employs a pun, a play on words, to try to provide some guidance on how these men and women conduct themselves with regard to their physical heads by drawing upon and developing these metaphorical heads, these relationships that would be reflected upon by this conduct. And the point for us, without getting lost in all the weeds of some of the contextual, cultural details, I suggest is this: seek to honor God and others in dress and in conduct, as well as the rest of life. So you know what? As I was finishing some final touches on this last night, I was in my basement. So I'm like, you know what? I want to see what state that downstairs bathroom's in. And you know what? It's not bad. I wouldn't mind you come and see my downstairs bathroom. In fact, there's some very interesting things down there. We've got some very interesting bright pink and bright orange metal cabinets that I got from IKEA, and we've sort of affixed them to the walls like helter-skelter everywhere. It's very freewheeling, very interesting. I think you'd enjoy seeing those cabinets. I have a very interesting painting on the wall generated by artificial intelligence program. And this particular painting is a nature scene, and it's interesting because the computer wasn't even smart enough to make the reflections on the water match. So there's this nice orange house up on the hill and right on the shore, and then the reflection in the water is just trees, and there's no orange house. And I just love that. I think you would love that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, as much as I might hesitate, like, I don't know if I want you in my downstairs bathroom, actually I would. You're invited. So anytime, I'll come and show you my cabinets and our cool picture. And so likewise, there are parts of the Bible where we're like, I don't know. But I think it's fair to say, really, if we spend enough time there rooting around, there's some valuable and interesting things there for us to learn. So let's pray. Father, we recognize we are far removed from the ancient setting of this letter, but the dynamics are the same because our hearts are the same, and our desires to advance ourselves, to fit in, to identify ourselves by praise or applause of others. I don't know, Lord. You know our hearts. So we pray that we will think carefully on these matters, and that our hearts will desire to honor you in every respect, and that the way we conduct ourselves in every aspect of life, including a public conduct, God, will be in fact in line with the accord of a heart fixed and set on you. And we ask you for your blessing and guidance and help in all of this. In Jesus' name, amen.